The morning they auctioned off the worst piece of land in Colton County, Texas, Sarah Graves showed up with 37 cents in her coat pocket and a pride so fierce it could have stopped a stampede dead in its tracks. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Red Rock Flats sat baking under an April sun that had already forgotten the kindness of winter. The settlement was small but ambitious, the kind of place that believed it might one day become something, given enough grit and rainfall, neither of which arrived in consistent supply. The main street was nothing more than a wide stretch of packed earth flanked by a general store, a saloon that also served as a dentist's office on Saturdays, a post office the size of a broom closet, and a land registry office that smelled permanently of linseed oil and old paper. There was a church under construction at the far end of town, its steeple half-finished, pointing toward heaven in a way that suggested the congregation had run out of money before they could quite reach it. Sarah Graves had ridden into Red Rock Flats 8 months prior on a borrowed mule, with everything she owned packed into a canvas bag that had once belonged to her late husband, Daniel. Daniel Graves had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1877, leaving Sarah with a kind memory, a worn wedding ring, and debts she had spent 6 months paying off by taking in laundry and mending saddles in the town of Crestwood, 3 days east. When those debts were finally settled, she had packed her canvas bag, returned the mule to old Hector Price who'd loaned it, and walked most of the way to Red Rock Flats because she had heard there was work there and something else, something harder to name. A chance, the raw, unadorned possibility of a life built by her own 2 hands. She was 28 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed, with the kind of face that was not immediately beautiful but that became beautiful slowly, the way a landscape does when you give it time. She was neither tall nor short, but she carried herself with a straight back and a direct gaze that made most men in Red Rock Flats slightly uncomfortable, which was fine by her. She had taken a job at Mrs. Ella Thorne's boarding house, cooking breakfast and supper in exchange for a narrow room off the kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried lavender. It was not a grand life, but it was hers. The land auction had been announced 3 weeks prior by a notice tacked to the door of the general store. The county was offloading parcels of unclaimed territory, most of them decent stretches of grassland or timber, and the bidding was expected to be lively. But there was one parcel that nobody wanted, a 40-acre plot on the eastern edge of the county that the notice described, with unusual bureaucratic honesty, as rocky, largely unworkable, with minimal water access and no existing structures. Someone, perhaps a board clerk with a sense of humor, had scrawled beneath the official description in pencil, "Good luck." The townsfolk had taken to calling it the Devil's Plate. The earth there was hard and pale, shot through with limestone ridges that broke the surface like the spines of buried creatures. A shallow creek ran along its southern edge for about 4 months of the year and vanished entirely in the heat of summer. The grass that managed to grow there was thin and brown and tasted of nothing that any self-respecting cattle would voluntarily eat. It had been offered at auction twice before, and both times had attracted no bids at all. The county assessor, a tired man named Horace Webb, had included it in this auction more out of administrative obligation than any genuine hope. Sarah Graves had ridden out to look at the Devil's Plate on a borrowed horse 2 weeks before the auction. She had spent the better part of an afternoon walking the 40 acres, her boots crunching on the pale limestone, her eyes moving carefully over every inch of what she saw. Most people looked at that land and saw failure. Sarah looked at it and saw something else, something that she could not yet name but that hummed quietly in the back of her mind the way a distant song hums when you can hear it but not quite make out the words. There was a natural depression on the northeastern corner, a wide shallow basin that collected rainwater and held it longer than the rest of the ground because the limestone formed a natural seal beneath it. It was dry now, cracked at the edges, but the rings of darker soil told her that in wetter seasons, that basin pooled deep, There were wild herbs growing along the western fence line, tough and stubborn as the land itself. And the rocky ridges, which everyone else saw as obstacles, struck Sarah as something else entirely. She had grown up in Missouri with a father who built stone walls, and she had spent her childhood learning the language of limestone. Those ridges could be quarried. The stone could be sold. In a territory where every man with ambition was building something, dressed stone was worth real money. She had gone back to her narrow room and done her arithmetic on the back of an old envelope, tiny careful numbers that added up to a plan that was ambitious to the point of being slightly mad. She would need water first. The basin could be deepened. A well could be dug further south where the water table was reachable. She could grow hardy crops on the western portion, drought-tolerant things, sorghum and sweet potatoes. And the quarry work on those limestone ridges could bring in enough income to keep her afloat while the land slowly became what she needed it to be. The only problem was the money. The auction minimum was set at $12. Sarah had 37 cents. She had spent the 2 weeks before the auction doing every piece of extra work she could find. She took in extra laundry. She helped the blacksmith's wife preserve a winter's worth of vegetables. She mended every torn garment in the boarding house and charged a small fee for it. Mrs. Thorne, who was a decent woman underneath her brisk manner, paid her a small bonus for 3 weeks of extra good cooking. By the morning of the auction, Sarah had accumulated $4.60, which she carried in a small cloth purse sewn to the inside of her coat. It was not $12. It was not even close to $12. But she showed up anyway, standing at the back of the small crowd that had gathered outside the land registry office on that bright April morning, because she had learned somewhere along the years that showing up was at least half of most things. The auctioneer was a round-faced man named Gerald Potts who wore a hat 3 sizes too big for his head, and compensated for this by speaking with tremendous authority. He worked his way through the better parcels first, and the crowd was lively for those. Good grassland went for $40 and $50. A wooded tract near the river fetched $62. People clapped and congratulated each other, and the morning had the cheerful air of commerce going well. Then Gerald Potts cleared his throat and looked down at his papers and said, with a notable lack of enthusiasm, Lot 14, the Eastern 40, also known as the Colton East Parcel. Rocky terrain, limited water, no structures. County minimum is $5. He paused. Somebody has to take it. There was scattered laughter. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances that communicated clearly that somebody was not going to be them. Sarah Graves raised her hand. $5, she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. Gerald Potts looked at her with what might have been pity. $5 bid by the lady in the brown coat. Do we have 6? Silence. $5 going once, Potts said. Going twice, $6. The voice came from the far edge of the crowd, low and unhurried, with the particular quality of a man who was used to being heard without raising it. Sarah turned, and so did most of the crowd. He was leaning against the wall of the general store with his arms crossed and one boot propped against the wood behind him, like a man who had wandered into the auction by accident and then decided to participate on a whim. He was perhaps 32 or 33, broad in the shoulders, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. His clothes were clean but worn, the clothes of a working man, and his hat was pushed back far enough on his head to show a face that was weathered and plain in the way that the land itself was plain, not pretty, but quietly compelling if you looked long enough. He was not the most handsome man Sarah had ever seen, but there was something steady in his expression, something patient and unhurried that she noticed even through her irritation, because she was absolutely, thoroughly irritated. $6, she said back without hesitation. I have $6. She did not have $6. She had $4.60, but she said it with such complete conviction that even she almost believed it for a moment. The man at the edge of the crowd looked at her with mild interest. 7, he said. 8, she said. 9, she hesitated. She had now bid $2 more than she possessed. The crowd was watching with the particular delight that humans reserve for watching other humans do something either brave or foolish. $9 going once, Gerald Potts said, with considerably more enthusiasm now. Going twice. 10, Sarah said. She would find the money. She would find it somewhere. She would find it somehow. That land was hers. The man against the wall uncrossed his arms and looked at her more carefully now, something shifting in his expression that she couldn't quite read. $15, he said. The crowd made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. $15 for the Devil's Plate was an act of either supreme confidence or supreme stupidity, and Redrock Flats was not yet sure which. Sarah Graves stood very still. She looked at the 40 acres she had walked for an afternoon, at the limestone ridges she had looked at and seen quarry stone, at the basin she had looked at and seen stored water, at the thin brown grass she had looked at and seen possibility. And then she looked at the number in her mind, $4.60, and she knew she was beaten. $15 going once, Gerald Potts said. Twice. Sold to the gentleman by the general store. The crowd applauded in that absent way crowds applaud when they're mostly just glad the awkward part is over. Sarah did not move. She stood at the back of the crowd with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin up and her eyes burning in a way that had nothing to do with tears. She would not cry. She had not cried when Daniel died, and she was not going to cry over a piece of land she had never technically owned. She turned to leave. "Excuse me." The voice was behind her, unhurried, the same low voice that had bid against her. She turned back with the particular expression that women in 1878 who were barely holding themselves together adopt when they do not want anyone to know it. Composed, cool, and slightly dangerous. He was right there, closer than she expected, holding his hat in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. Up close his eyes were hazel, the kind of hazel that shifts between brown and green depending on the light, and there was an expression in them that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not amusement, something more careful than either. "Roscoe Keene," he said. He didn't extend his hand right away, which she later thought was either rudeness or the particular awareness of a man who understood that a woman in that moment might not want to be touched. "I work the Hiller Ranch North Pasture. I know where the Hiller Ranch is," she said. "What do you want, Mr. Keene?" He held out the folded piece of paper. "This is yours." She looked at it without taking it. "I don't know what that is." "It's the deed to Lot 14, he said. "The Eastern 40, he paused. "The land you wanted." She stared at him. The crowd had largely dispersed now, filtering away toward the saloon or the general store or wherever people went after witnessing something they couldn't quite explain, but a few lingered at the edges, watching. Sarah was acutely aware of them. "I didn't win the bid," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "I did, and I'm giving it to you." She looked at the deed and then at him and said, "Why?" It was the right question, the only question. And she asked it directly because she had learned a long time ago that the most important questions deserve to be asked straight. Roscoe Keene was quiet for a moment, and she got the impression that he was a man who thought before he spoke, which was a quality she found both reassuring and slightly maddening given the present circumstances. "Because you wanted it more than I did," he said, "and because you looked at that land like you actually saw something in it, and I don't think you'd have bid past what you had if you didn't have a plan." "You have no idea what I have," she said. "No," he said, "but I could tell you had something." She looked at the deed again. Her heart was doing something complicated that she did not have the time or inclination to examine. "I can't accept a gift from a stranger," she said. "It's not a gift," he said. "It's a transfer of property, entirely above board. Gerald Potts can witness it right now if you like." He nodded toward the auctioneer, who was still hovering nearby with the particular expression of a man who senses he may be needed for paperwork. Sarah Graves stood in the April sunshine outside the Land Registry office in Redrock Flats, Texas, in the spring of 1878 and made a decision in approximately 4 seconds that would alter the entire course of her life. She reached out and took the deed from Roscoe Keene's hand. "I will pay you back every cent of the $15, she said, with interest. Something moved across his face, brief and warm. "There's no need, there is," she said. "There is absolutely a need. I don't take charity, Mr. Keene, and I don't owe favors I can't account for. $15, I'll have it within a year. I'll send it to the Hiller Ranch." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. Gerald Potts transferred the deed in less than 10 minutes, and Sarah Graves walked back to the boarding house with a 40-acre plot of land in her coat pocket, and $4.60 that no longer needed to be anything other than a start. She lay awake that night in her narrow room and stared at the ceiling and thought about Roscoe Keene's hazel eyes and the way he had said, "You looked at that land like you actually saw something in it." And then she firmly told herself to stop thinking about Roscoe Keene's hazel eyes and go to sleep. She did not go to sleep for a very long time. She began working the land the following week. She borrowed tools from Mrs. Thorne's late husband's shed, negotiating their use in exchange for extra kitchen work. She rose before dawn and rode out to the Eastern 40 on a horse she had arranged to borrow from the Calhoun farm in exchange for mending saddle leather every weekend. The work was brutal and slow and satisfying in a way that nothing had been satisfying for a very long time. She began by clearing the most workable strip along the western edge, pulling rocks by hand, turning the thin soil, mixing in dried manure she collected from the edges of the road and from the Calhoun farm for a modest fee. She planted sorghum and sweet potatoes as she had planned, along with a short row of hardy vegetables, tomatoes and squash and beans, in a sheltered spot where the limestone ridges blocked the worst of the western wind. She was alone out there most days. The solitude suited her. She talked to herself sometimes, planning aloud, working through problems the way her father had taught her, by saying them out loud until they stopped being problems and became solutions. She also talked to the land, which she knew was a little eccentric but which she did privately and without apology. The well was her most pressing problem. She needed water, and the basin in the northeastern corner, while promising, needed work before it could be relied upon. She had walked the southern edge of the property twice more and was increasingly convinced that the water table was accessible there. But digging a well was not a one-woman job, and hiring a well digger cost money she didn't have. It was on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the auction that she arrived at the eastern edge of her property and found someone already there. Roscoe Keene was standing in the southern section of her land with a long metal rod, pressing it into the earth at intervals and listening. His horse was tied to the fence post nearby, and he had his hat off and his sleeves rolled up and was entirely focused on whatever he was doing. Sarah tied her borrowed horse to the other fence post and walked across to him with the deliberate stride of a woman who wants an explanation. "Mr. Keene," she said. He looked up without apparent surprise, as if he had been expecting her. "Miss Graves." "Mrs. Graves," she corrected automatically, and then wished she hadn't, because it made her think of Daniel, which made her feel guilty, and the guilt made her more sharp than she intended. "What are you doing on my property?" "Looking for the best spot for your well," he said simply. He pressed the rod into the earth again, inclined his head, listened to something she couldn't hear. "I think it's here." He pressed his boot into the ground. "About 18 feet down, maybe 20. The Hiller Ranch sank 2 wells in similar ground, and both of them came in before 22 feet. She crossed her arms. "I didn't ask for your help." "No," he agreed. "And I can't pay you for well digging right now." "I'm not asking to be paid." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Keene, I appreciate what you did at the auction, I do, but I am not in need of a benefactor. I have a plan for this land, and I am capable of executing it myself." He met her gaze without defensiveness. "I don't doubt that," he said, "but a well takes 2 people. You can't swing the digger and haul the bucket at the same time. I'm off from the Hiller Ranch on Thursdays and Sundays. If you want the well, I'll help you dig it." If you don't want me here, I'll go." He said all of this in the same unhurried tone he had used at the auction, the tone of a man who had decided something and was simply stating it, without drama, without manipulation, without the edge of wanting something in return that she had learned to recognize and brace against in men. He just meant what he said. She could see that, and it was disarming in a way she didn't entirely appreciate because it made it harder to be appropriately guarded. "One condition," she said. "Name it. You treat this as a business arrangement. I will pay you back for the $15 and for the labor." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, "but the $15 really doesn't need." "Business arrangement," she said. "Business arrangement," he agreed, and there was a ghost of something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and she turned away before it could become anything she needed to account for. They dug the well over 4 Thursdays and 2 Sundays. The work was hard and dirty and involved a great deal of hauling rock and soil, and Roscoe Keene was, as she had reluctantly admitted to herself by the 2nd Thursday, an exceptionally competent man with a shovel. He worked without complaint and without unnecessary conversation, which she appreciated, but he also had a habit of saying 1 or 2 things over the course of a day that were so unexpectedly perceptive that she found herself thinking about them later. On the 2nd Thursday, he had paused at midday while they ate their separate lunches at opposite ends of a flat limestone rock that served as a bench, and he said, "You grew up near Quarry Stone. The way you look at those ridges." "My father built stone walls in Missouri," she said. "Good walls. The best walls I've ever seen," she said, and meant it, and felt a small pang of something that was part grief and part pride. Her father had been dead for 10 years. "Then you've got the right instincts for this place," Roscoe said, and went back to his lunch. On the 3rd Sunday, while they were hauling particularly stubborn rock from the shaft, she asked him why he worked for the Hiller Ranch instead of having his own land. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I had land about 60 miles east, tried to homestead it after I came back from." He paused. "I was in the army. Afterward I filed on some land and started working it. But there was a drought 2 years running and then a fire, and by the time it was all done I had nothing but debt." He said this without self-pity, the way a man reports the weather. "Sold the claim to pay the debt and came west, been with Hiller for 3 years. "Do you want your own land again?" she asked. "Someday," he said, "when it's the right land." She thought about that. Then she said, "The limestone ridges on the northeast section. I'm going to quarry them. I've been looking at the size of the blocks, and I think I can get 2 or 3 dozen good dressed stones a month once I have the right tools. Enough to sell to the builders in town." He looked at the ridges with new attention. "You'd need a hand sledge and a set of chisels to start," he said, "and a wagon to haul the dressed stone to town." "I know," she said. "I'm working out the order of operations." He nodded slowly. "The well first, then the plantings established, then the quarry." "Yes." "Smart," he said. And that was all he said about it, but she caught the way he looked at her then, briefly and without concealment, and the quality of that look lodged somewhere in her chest like a warm splinter and did not come out. The well came in on a Saturday afternoon in late May, clear and cold, and with a pressure that made them both laugh out loud with genuine delight when the water surged up over the edge of the first bucket. Sarah Graves laughed more freely than she had laughed in longer than she could remember, and Roscoe Keene laughed with her. And for just a moment they were 2 people standing in a field with water on their hands and pure happiness on their faces. And the space between them was full of something that neither of them had named yet, but that was taking up considerable room. He brought his hand up and wiped water from her face where it had splashed, a gesture that was entirely automatic and entirely without forethought, and his fingers brushed her cheek and they both went very still. "I beg your pardon," he said quietly. "No," she said, and then, because that sounded strange, "don't apologize. It's only water." But they both knew it wasn't only water, and neither of them said anything more about it that day. She paid him in early June, not money, because she still didn't have enough of that, but in a long afternoon of labor helping him repair a stretch of fence on the Hiller Ranch north pasture that had come down in a storm. It wasn't the $15. It was a gesture, an acknowledgement that the business arrangement ran both ways. He accepted it in the same spirit she offered it, simply and without ceremony, and they worked side by side for 6 hours with the easy rhythm of people who had already learned each other's pace. On the ride back, she asked him about his time in the army. He was quiet again in that way she had come to understand was not evasion but consideration, the act of a man choosing his words. "I was 18 when I enlisted," he said. 1864. He was 32 now, she had figured, which meant the arithmetic of the war years was written into his life in ways she could not entirely see. "I came back different than I went." He paused. "Most men did. I don't talk about the war much. But I came back knowing that what I wanted was land of my own and silence, and to build something with my hands. The land part took some time." "The silence part?" she asked. He glanced at her sideways. "That part I've got," he said, and then more quietly, "or I did." She looked straight ahead at the trail and did not say anything, and the air between them hummed with the thing neither of them was quite ready to say. The sorghum came in beautifully in July. The sweet potatoes were slow but steady. The vegetables in the sheltered corner flourished in a way that surprised even Sarah, who had believed they would do well but had not expected them to do this well. She brought the first tomatoes to Mrs. Thorne, who received them with genuine pleasure and promptly incorporated them into the boarding house supper, and added a small bonus to Sarah's weekly wage. The herbs along the western fence line turned out to include wild sage and something she was fairly certain was a variety of medicinal rosemary, and she gathered these carefully and sold small bundles to the general store, which sold them to women in the territory who used them for medicine and cooking. It was not yet a prosperous life, but it was a growing one. She could feel it growing the way you feel a plant pushing through soil, not visible yet, but present, straining upward. Roscoe came on Thursdays and Sundays through the summer, more out of habit than plan now, and they had fallen into the kind of working partnership that begins as a practical arrangement and gradually becomes something that fills more space than the work itself. He brought tools from the Hiller Ranch sometimes, borrowed with the easy permission of a trusted employee, and she fed him supper at the end of work days. Plain food cooked over a small fire she made near the southern fence where she was slowly, one board at a time, building a simple shelter. He ate everything she cooked with genuine appreciation and no performance, the way a hungry man eats who has also been raised with enough courtesy not to wolf his food. They talked. This was the thing that crept up on her, the talking. She had not talked, really talked, with a man since Daniel, and Daniel had been a quiet man himself, kind but not given to conversation. Roscoe Keene was also not a talker in the general social sense, but alone with her he talked. He told her about Missouri, where he had also grown up, one county north of where she had lived, and this small coincidence felt like something more than coincidence. The way two rivers joining is more than just water meeting water. He told her about the homestead he had tried and lost, without bitterness, but with a precision of detail that told her he had thought about it for a long time. He told her about a younger brother named Caleb who was farming cotton near San Antonio and who wrote letters that were mostly complaints, and which Roscoe read with the fond exasperation of a man who loves his brother despite finding him irritating. She told him things too, about her father's stone walls. About Daniel gently, because it seemed important to be honest about Daniel. She told Roscoe that Daniel had been a good man and a kind husband, but that their marriage had been a quiet thing, more partnership than passion, and that she had grieved him genuinely but not with the kind of grief that empties you, and that she had spent some time feeling guilty about that, and had finally decided the guilt was not useful. Roscoe had listened to all of this with his full attention, which was something she was learning was one of his most particular qualities, the ability to simply listen without filling the space. "You don't have to account for how you grieve," he said when she finished. "Grief doesn't have a proper form." "No," she agreed. "I know that now." "How long were you married?" "4 years," she said. "Were you happy?" She considered this. "I was comfortable," she said honestly. "And comfortable was more than a lot of women had. I don't think I was built for just comfortable." He looked at her for a long time. The sun was going down behind the limestone ridges, and the light was the orange-gold color that only happened in Texas in August evenings. That particular light that makes everything look like it was painted by someone who loved the subject. In that light, Roscoe Keene's weathered face looked almost beautiful to her, and the looking made her feel things she had been carefully not feeling for several months. "No," he said softly, "I don't imagine you were." The quarrying began in September when she had saved enough to buy the basic tools. She hired 2 men for the heavy splitting work, brothers named Mace and Tom Elray, who were looking for seasonal work between cattle drives and who were strong and reliable and perfectly content to be directed by a woman, having been raised, they informed her, by a mother who had once negotiated a land dispute with a railroad company and won. The Elray brothers worked 4 days a week and were paid a portion of each week's stone sale revenue, a system Sarah devised because it meant she did not need immediate cash to pay them, only future sales, and that aligned their interests with hers. The first load of dressed limestone went to town in late September on a rented wagon, 14 blocks of pale stone cut to consistent dimensions, and sold to the carpenter who was finishing the church steeple for a total of $8.40. Sarah stood in front of the general store holding that money and felt something unlock in her chest that had been tightly latched for a very long time. She walked to the land registry office and paid Horace Webb the remaining county fees on her deed, which reduced her available cash significantly. But the land was now fully and formally and irrevocably hers. She walked out of that office with the stamped deed in her hand and stood in the October sunlight and felt a thing she could not have adequately described, a kind of rooted certainty, the sense of belonging to a place. She was standing there when Roscoe came around the corner of the general store with a bag of feed over one shoulder, evidently in town for Hiller Ranch supplies. He stopped when he saw her face. "Good news," he said. She held up the deed. "Fully paid," she said. "Every county fee." The look on his face then was something she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. Not envy, not anything complicated, just pure, unguarded pleasure at her happiness, the pleasure of someone for whom your good fortune genuinely feels like good fortune. His face opened up completely in that moment, and she saw the man underneath the habitual composure, bright-eyed and warm and uncomplicated in his happiness for her. "Sarah," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and neither of them acknowledged this but both of them registered it. She could see that in the slight shift of his expression. "Come have supper at Mrs. Thorne's tonight," she said. "She's making roast chicken and I baked a pie this morning." He came. He sat across from her at the long boarding-house table with Mrs. Thorne presiding at the head, and 2 of the male boarders filling out the company. And they ate Mrs. Thorne's roast chicken and Sarah's apple pie. And Mrs. Thorne watched the 2 of them throughout the entire meal with an expression of such barely suppressed satisfaction that Sarah, who had always been perceptive about people, noticed it and felt her face grow warm in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen heat. After supper, when the boarders had retreated and Mrs. Thorne had diplomatically found something to attend to in the far end of the house, Sarah and Roscoe sat on the boarding-house porch in the October evening and talked in the way that people talk when they are on the edge of something and both know it. "I owe you $11.40 still," she said. She had paid him $3.60 across various small payments over the months. "Sarah," he said patiently. $11.40, she repeated. He was quiet. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." He was silent long enough that the night sounds had time to organize themselves, the insects, the distant sound of something at the saloon, the wind in the oak tree at the edge of Mrs. Thorne's yard. "What are you planning for the land?" he said finally. "The full plan, the one you haven't told all of." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You've talked about the sorghum and the sweet potatoes and the quarry," he said. "But there's more. I can tell when you're walking the property and you look east toward the far section. There's something there you haven't said." She was quiet for a moment. "A proper farmhouse," she said, "eventually, using the quarry stone. And a larger garden, enough to supply the boarding house and maybe the saloon. And a bigger well, a second one in the north section." She paused. "I want it to be a working farm, a real one, not just surviving." "That's a lot for one person," he said. "I know," she said. He turned his hat over in his hands, which she had come to recognize as a gesture he made when he was working up to something. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about leaving the Hiller Ranch." She waited. "I've got some money saved," he said. "Not a great deal, but some, enough to buy materials, and I know how to build a stone house. I helped build 3 of them in Missouri and 2 since." He paused. "I'm not asking anything that you haven't asked for," he said carefully. "I'm not assuming, but I want to say plainly that I would like to be part of what you're building on that land, if you'd have me." She turned to look at him directly. The porch lamp threw a warm circle of light around them, and his face was open and earnest and slightly anxious, which was the first time she had seen anxiety in it, and it moved her more than confidence would have. "Are you asking to be my partner in a business arrangement?" she said, and there was the slightest edge of testing in her voice, a needle of challenge to see what he said back. He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking to be more than that," he said. "If you'd have me, if you're ready for that, I understand. If you're not, I can be patient." He said this last part with a simple directness that made her want to laugh and also made her want to reach across the space between them. "Roscoe," she said. "Yes." $11.40, she said. He looked at her blankly. "Once I've paid the $11.40, she said, "the business arrangement will be settled." And then she stopped, gathered herself, and said clearly, "And then I think I would like to talk about the other thing." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "How long will that take?" "A month," she said. "Maybe 6 weeks." "All right," he said. 6 weeks." She paid him the $11.40 in exactly 5 weeks, the last payment pressed into his hand after a Thursday of stone hauling with a look that dared him to refuse it. He did not refuse it. He folded the money carefully into his shirt pocket and looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with moments when he was deciding something. "Payment settled," he said. "Payment settled," she agreed. "Then I'd like to talk about the other thing," he said. They were standing in the middle of her land in the pale November light, with the limestone ridges behind them and the well they had dug together to the south, and the winter-dormant garden to the west. The land looked hard and austere in November, but she had spent enough time on it now to see its seasons changing and to know what it would look like in spring. "I care about you a great deal," she said. She had never been a woman who performed her feelings. "I have been careful about it because I am careful about most things, but I care about you." "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for a while." "You might have said something sooner," she said. "You had a business arrangement to settle," he said. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound of it made the quiet landscape seem suddenly warmer. He smiled at her, fully this time, the whole face opening, and she saw again what she had seen in October outside the registry office, the warm, unguarded man underneath the composure, and this time she did not look away from it. He reached out slowly and she took his hand. His hand was rough from work and warm and large, and it held hers with a careful steadiness that felt like everything she had ever wanted from a person, the particular steadiness of someone who knows his own strength and uses it gently. "I'm not ready to make any promises I can't keep," she said, "but I'm ready to find out if there are promises worth making." "That's all I'm asking," he said. They stood in the November light on her 40 acres of rocky hard-luck land and held hands and looked out over it together, and the land looked back at them without apology, just as it was, difficult and stubborn and full of potential, which was perhaps why they both understood it so well. Winter settled over the territory with the businesslike efficiency, of a season that had no patience for sentiment. The limestone ridges were gray and cold against a sky that spent most of December the color of old pewter, and the creek on the southern edge of Sarah's property disappeared entirely, as she had known it would. But the well held. The water in the basin was deeper than it had been in the fall, and she covered it with a temporary frame of pine boards to protect it from the worst of the cold. She was still working at Mrs. Thorne's boarding house, rising before dawn to start the morning fires and cook breakfast, working her land on afternoons, and whatever daylight remained after her duties. It was an exhausting schedule, but she had been exhausted before, and knew that exhaustion was not a permanent state unless you let it be. She was saving carefully, every spare cent going into a tin box she kept under her narrow bed, which was slowly accumulating the kind of sum that could buy real building materials in the spring. Roscoe left the Hiller ranch in December, on good terms with old Silas Hiller himself, who pressed a bonus month's wages into his hand and said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of an old man, "You've got something worth going to. I can see it." Roscoe took a room at the other boarding house in Redrock Flats, a smaller establishment run by a taciturn man named Burrell, and spent his days doing paid carpentry work around town, building fences and shelving and a new bar counter for the saloon, and his Thursdays and Sundays on Sarah's land. They were courting, though neither of them used that word exactly. What they did was spend time together in the way that people spend time when they have decided that the other person is worth knowing all the way down, and every layer revealed was another small confirmation of the original decision. He met her at church on Sundays when the congregation had finally gotten enough money to finish the steeple, the very steeple built from her quarry stone, which she privately found enormously satisfying. He walked her back to Mrs. Thorne's afterward, and they talked on the porch in the cold, and Mrs. Thorne brought them hot coffee without being asked, which was her version of a benediction. They went to the Christmas social at the schoolhouse together, which formalized their situation in the eyes of Redrock Flats as definitively as any announcement could have. The town had opinions about them, as small towns have opinions about everything, but the opinions were largely warm, tempered by the general respect for Sarah's evident competence and Roscoe's equally evident decency. A few people were less generous, notably a man named Brant Collier who owned a competing stone supply operation out of the next county, and who had recently discovered that the dressed limestone coming out of Sarah Graves's Eastern 40 was considerably better quality than his own product, and was being priced accordingly. Brant Collier made several unpleasant remarks around town about women running quarrying operations, remarks that were received with varying levels of endorsement depending on the audience. Sarah was aware of these remarks and chose to answer them with the most effective available response, which was to keep producing excellent stone and let the quality speak. There was also the matter of a group of men, 3 of them, who showed up at her property in early February and said they were there to inspect the land for county water rights violations, a claim that had the distinct smell of fabrication about it. Sarah asked to see their county credentials, and they produced documents that looked wrong, the printing too smudged, the seal not quite right. She told them calmly that she would be in the county assessor's office the following morning to verify the legitimacy of their authority, and that in the meantime they were welcome to leave her property. They exchanged glances and left. She went to Horace Webb's office the next morning, and he confirmed, with evident unease, that he had issued no such inspection order and knew nothing of these men. Sarah filed a complaint with the county sheriff, a capable man named Del Totham, who investigated and discovered that the 3 men had been sent by Brant Collier in what amounted to a harassment campaign designed to intimidate Sarah into either abandoning or selling the Eastern 40. Sheriff Totham paid Brant Collier a very direct visit, and the harassment stopped. Roscoe had been quietly furious about this, the first time she had seen real anger in him. A contained and cold anger that was more frightening than rage would have been precisely because of how controlled it was. He did not go after Collier himself because Sarah asked him not to, and because he understood that she was right, that the law was the appropriate instrument and that she had used it effectively. But she saw in those days what kind of man he became when he believed something important was being threatened, and what she saw did not alarm her. It steadied her. "You handled it better than I could have," he told her. "You would have handled it," she said, "just differently. Less patiently," he said. "Yes," she agreed, and there was warmth in her voice that had nothing to do with patience. In March, they began the foundation of the farmhouse together. They used her quarry stone, the finest blocks, selected with care, and Roscoe proved exactly as good at stone construction as he had claimed, which was very good indeed. He had a methodical precision to his building that complemented her planning instincts, and they worked together with an ease that had been months in the developing, the ease of two people whose rhythms have learned each other. The Elroy brothers helped on heavy days. A young man named Pete from the general store offered to help on weekends in exchange for learning stonework, and Sarah agreed, because she had never been opposed to teaching what she knew. The walls of the farmhouse rose through March and April, and by the end of April the structure was standing with windows framed and a roof going on, built from good timber that Roscoe had arranged through a lumber merchant in the county seat. It was a small house, 3 rooms, but solid as the land it stood on, and the walls were 18 inches thick and would hold heat in winter and cool in summer with a reliability that wood frame houses in the territory could only aspire to. On the last day of April, when they were standing inside the finished shell of the house, and the late afternoon light was coming through the window openings in golden columns and lighting up the stone walls, Roscoe turned to her and said her name in the particular way he had developed of saying it when he was about to say something that mattered. "Sarah." "Yes," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. He was not performing this. He said it the way he said everything important, directly and without theater, looking at her with those hazel eyes that she had spent a year learning to read. "I don't have a great deal to offer you in the way of worldly goods. I have some money saved and my tools and the capability to work and an honest intention to work hard and treat you well for the rest of my life." He paused. "I also think we are well suited to each other in ways that matter more than money, but you should say whatever you truly think." Sarah Graves looked around the stone walls of the house that stood on the land she had bid on with 37 cents and a plan, the land she had been given by a stranger who had looked at her and seen something, and she looked at that stranger, who was not a stranger any more at all, and she said, "Yes." He crossed the room and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her, it was a first kiss and not a first kiss at the same time, the way anything feels when it has been building for a long while. It was careful and warm and thorough, and when they stepped apart his hands were on her face and she was holding the front of his shirt and the late April light was still doing its golden thing through the window openings and the stone walls were strong around them. "When?" she said. "As soon as you like," he said. "June," she said. "I want the spring planting in first." He laughed, quiet and warm. "June," he agreed. They were married on the 14th of June, 1879, in the church whose steeple had been built from stone cut out of Sarah's land. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Allen Marsh, who was a good-humored man with a talent for brevity, which both Sarah and Roscoe appreciated. Mrs. Thorne was there in her best dress with tears in her eyes that she would have denied if asked. The Elroy brothers came, Mace and Tom, cleaned up to a remarkable degree. Silas Hiller came from the north pasture with his wife and his dog, who sat outside the church during the ceremony and waited. Sheriff Del Totham came. Young Pete from the general store came and spent a good portion of the service looking at Mace Elroy's sister, who had come with Mace, which was a story that would develop at its own pace, and which is not this story. Sarah wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself over the winter, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs that had belonged to her mother. Roscoe wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, and a jacket he had borrowed from Sela's Hiller that fit him almost perfectly. He looked, she thought, watching him wait for her at the front of the church, like a man who knew exactly where he was and why, and she walked toward him with the same straight back and direct gaze she had walked into Redrock Flats with 2 years before, but lighter in her chest than she had been then, as if something that had been tightly compressed was finally able to expand. He held her hand through the ceremony with that careful steadiness that she had come to understand was not a performance but simply the natural expression of who he was, a man whose strength was gentle and whose steadiness was real. When Reverend Marsh said the words that made it official and Roscoe looked at her, she looked back without flinching or qualifying or holding anything in reserve, because she had decided a long time ago that this was the thing she had not been built for just comfortable for, and she was right. They had a small celebration afterward at the boarding house, which Mrs. Thorne had decorated with early summer flowers, and where she had spent 2 days cooking more food than 20 people could have eaten, which 22 people proceeded to eat anyway. There was dancing in the parlor to a fiddle played with great enthusiasm and variable accuracy by a man named Cordell, who was otherwise notable for having the finest mustache in Colton County. Sarah danced with Roscoe in the crowded parlor, and he was not a graceful dancer, but he was a determined one, and she was laughing too much to be critical. "I should tell you something," he said, close to her ear as they turned in the small space. "What?" she said. "I never wanted that land," he said. She leaned back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "The devil's plate," he said. "I never had any intention of using it. I saw you at the back of the crowd looking at it like you were planning something, and I could see you couldn't get the bid high enough, so I got it high enough." He paused. "And then I gave it to you, because the plan I could see in your face when you looked at it, whatever it was, deserved to happen." She stared at him. "You planned it from the beginning," she said. "The outbidding, you planned it." "Not planned exactly," he said. "It was an impulse, but yes." "That was either the most presumptuous thing anyone has ever done for me," she said slowly, "or the kindest." "Probably both," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Roscoe Keene," she said. "Sarah Keene," he said back, testing the name, and the warmth in his voice when he said it made it ring through her like a struck bell. They moved into the stone farmhouse on the Eastern 40 in the last week of June, carrying their combined possessions in a wagon that Roscoe had borrowed from Sela's Hiller, which took 2 trips and was accomplished without argument, which they both privately considered a good sign. The house had 3 rooms, a main room that served as kitchen and sitting room, a bedroom, and a smaller room off the back that Sarah had already mentally assigned a purpose she had not yet spoken aloud. The summer of 1879 was good to the Eastern 40. The second well they dug in July, further north as Sarah had planned, came in at 19 feet and cold as November, and Roscoe whooped when the water showed, a sound she had never heard from him before and which she found unexpectedly delightful. The sorghum was the best crop she had grown yet, dense and tall and deep gold in the August heat. The limestone quarry was producing steadily, the Elroy brothers now working 4 days a week with Pete from the general store on Saturdays, and a new arrangement with a stone merchant from the county seat who was buying in bulk for a building project that would keep them supplied with orders through the following year. Sarah had taken on a young woman named Ada to help with the garden in exchange for room and board in the spare room, which meant the room Sarah had mentally assigned served a purpose after all, though she was already thinking about what purpose it would serve the following year. Ada was 16, sharp and hardworking, the daughter of a family that had come through a difficult season and had one too many mouths to feed. She learned fast and was grateful without being servile, and Sarah liked her very much. Roscoe had taken on occasional contract masonry work for other landowners in the territory, building stone foundations and walls and well casings, his reputation spreading through the county with the reliable momentum of quality work. He charged fair prices and delivered what he promised, and came home in the evenings with stone dust in his hair and a steadiness to his face that was contentment. She had come to recognize the particular contentment of a man who is doing the right work in the right place. They argued sometimes. Sarah was strong-willed and so was Roscoe, and their opinions did not always align, particularly on questions of how fast to expand the operation and how much financial risk was acceptable. She was bolder with money than he was, inclined to reinvest faster and trust the land's potential. He was more cautious, inclined to secure what they had before reaching further. These arguments were not gentle, but they were fair. Two people with genuine respect for each other's intelligence making a case and being willing to be persuaded. She won some. He won some. Occasionally they arrived at a third position that was better than either of the original two, which was its own kind of satisfaction. She told him in October that she was expecting a child. She told him over supper on a Tuesday evening, matter-of-factly watching his face. His face went through several things in rapid succession, none of which he tried to conceal from her. Surprise, then something that was not quite belief yet, then a joy so large and unguarded that it broke across his face like the August heat breaks the morning, and he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you? How do you feel?" "I feel fine," she said. "I've felt fine for weeks. I waited to be sure." "You should have told me sooner," he said, not as a reproach but as a statement of wanting to have known, to have shared it sooner. "I told you as soon as I was certain," she said. "I'm not one for worrying you over maybes." He brought her hands to his mouth and held them there, not kissing them exactly, just holding them against his lips, and she felt the warmth of his breath and the roughness of his jaw and the trembling quality of a man who is containing a feeling that is larger than his habitual composure. "Roscoe," she said gently. "I know," he said. His voice was thick. "I know I'm fine." He looked up at her. He stopped. "A family," he said. "A proper family, on this land." "On our land," she said. "On our land," he agreed. The winter was gentler that year, or perhaps it only seemed gentler because the stone house held the warmth so well, and because they were warmer together than either had been alone. Sarah kept working through the winter, though Roscoe was watchful and careful in ways that she found both touching and occasionally exasperating. And Ada turned out to be both a capable assistant and a matter-of-fact presence who was unfazed by pregnancy in the practical way of girls who had grown up in large rural families. In February, a letter arrived from Roscoe's brother Caleb in San Antonio. The cotton had done poorly 2 years running, and Caleb was thinking of coming west and wanted to know if there was work. Roscoe wrote back and offered him the spare room once Ada had found a suitable arrangement, and described the operation on the Eastern 40 in terms that were accurate but that Sarah suspected also conveyed, between the lines, everything Roscoe felt about the life he had found there. Their son was born on the 21st of March, 1880, in the stone farmhouse on the Eastern 40, attended by Mrs. Thorne, who had practical experience with births, and a capable woman named Mrs. Raised from the Mexican settlement 2 miles east, who was the closest thing the territory had to a midwife, and who had delivered more than 60 children over the years. The birth was long but not complicated, and when it was done and Mrs. Thorne put the baby in Sarah's arms, she looked down at him and felt the landslide quality of a love that is nothing like anything that came before it, vast and immediate and entirely without qualification. Roscoe was allowed in after a few minutes, having spent the preceding hours on the front step of the farmhouse in conditions that Mrs. Thorne later described as hovering like a weather vane in a high wind. And when he came in and saw Sarah and the baby, his face did the thing it had done when she told him she was expecting, only more so, stripped entirely of composure, entirely open. He sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful, terrified tenderness of a man who has never held anything so important. And the baby was entirely unimpressed by his father's emotional state, and was simply pink and squirming and already expressing opinions about the general arrangements. "He needs a name," Sarah said. "What do you want to call him?" Roscoe said, not taking his eyes off the baby. "Henry," she said, "after my father." He looked up at her. "Henry," he said. "Henry Keene." He tried it. "That's a good strong name." "It is," she agreed. Henry Daniel Keene, as he was eventually christened, with the Daniel for Sarah's first husband because she had loved Daniel in her way and thought he deserved to be remembered well, proved to be an extraordinarily enthusiastic person from the earliest weeks of his life. He was loud and curious and vigorous and looked, everyone agreed, very like his father around the jaw, though he had Sarah's dark eyes, and she found this combination entirely acceptable. Caleb Keene arrived in May, slightly thinner than his letters had suggested and considerably more cheerful than they had described. He was 26, with Roscoe's build but a more voluble disposition, and he took to the Eastern 40 with the energy of a man who has been waiting for the right kind of work without knowing what it was. He learned stoneworking from his brother with an aptitude that surprised everyone except Roscoe, who said flatly that Caleb had always been good with his hands when he wasn't being lazy about it, and Caleb took this as the high praise it was. Ada, who had found a room with the Calhoun family in exchange for helping with their garden, came back to the Eastern 40 to help 3 days a week now that the operation had grown, and she and Caleb were in the habit of having extended conversations about things that neither of them seemed to be able to finish before the other arrived, which Sarah observed with the quiet amusement of someone who has recently been on the other side of exactly that situation. The stone merchant from the county seat extended their contract in the summer of 1880, and with it came the investment in a second quarry operation on the Northeast Ridge, which meant hiring 2 more men and acquiring better equipment, a proper quarry chisel set, and a block-end tackle system for moving the larger stones that simplified the work considerably. The farm itself was producing enough that they had begun selling at the market in town on Saturdays, a small table of vegetables and herbs and fresh eggs from the 8 chickens that had arrived in spring, and established themselves on the property with the proprietary air of creatures who have found their permanent home. Sarah ran the market table herself on most Saturdays, with Roscoe or Caleb minding Henry when she was needed in town. She was a formidable market presence, direct and fair in her pricing, knowledgeable about what she was selling, and entirely willing to discuss the particulars of growing drought-tolerant vegetables in limestone-heavy soil with anyone who was interested, which, as the territory filled with new homesteaders trying to figure out the land, was a great many people. She began getting requests to advise on other people's land situations, informal consultations conducted over the market table or in the post office, or occasionally at the boarding house over Mrs. Thorne's coffee. She thought about this for a while, the consultations, and what they meant. Then she thought about the women she kept seeing at the market and in town, women in circumstances similar to those she had been in 2 years ago, trying to build something with not enough money and too much stubborn hope, and no particular guidance on how the specific character of this land worked. She talked to Roscoe about it one evening after Henry was down. "I want to start writing some of it down," she said. "What works on rocky lime soil? What crops can come through dry summers and what can't? Water conservation, the basin method. I want to write it as a practical guide." He considered this in the way he considered things. Who would publish it? "I don't know," she said. "Maybe nobody. Maybe I just make copies and distribute them at the market. Maybe the county agricultural office would be interested." She paused. "I just know what took me months to figure out that nobody told me, and there are women and men out here trying to work the same kind of ground and making the same mistakes I made." "Do it," he said. "It'll take time that I don't always have." "Do it," he said again. "Some things are worth the time they take." She did it. She wrote it at the kitchen table after Henry was asleep, in the evenings over the winter of 1880, a plain, practical document that she called Working the Hard Land, Notes on Rocky Soil Farming in Western Texas, which was not a poetic title but was a precisely accurate one. It covered water management, soil amendment with organic material, crop selection for drought-tolerant yield, the basics of small-scale limestone quarrying as a supplemental income, and the building of stone structures using local materials. She wrote it simply and directly, the way she talked, and when she was done it was 43 pages of handwritten text that Roscoe read in one sitting and then looked up and said, "This is genuinely good." She sent a copy to the county agricultural office in early 1881. The county agricultural agent, a progressive-minded man named Samuel Holt, who was trying to improve settlement outcomes in the region, wrote back within the month asking to have it reproduced and distributed to new homesteaders through his office. He offered to pay her a modest fee for the use of it, which she accepted with a dignity that concealed her delight. The fee was $12. She put $11.40 in a tin and walked out to the well she and Roscoe had dug together on the first Thursday of their acquaintance, the well that had come in cold and clear and been the first real proof that this land could give what you asked of it if you asked correctly. And she stood at its edge in the February cold with Roscoe beside her and said, "I'm putting this here, for the land, for what it gave us back." He looked at her. "The rest," she held up 60 cents. "For Henry's education fund," she said. "He'll need school money." Roscoe laughed, and it was the full laugh she loved, the one that had first surprised her at the well when the water came in, unguarded and genuine, and she laughed with him. And the cold air turned their breath to smoke, and the land around them was winter dormant but not dead, just waiting, as it always had been, for the right people to see what it held. The following years built themselves one upon the other with the solid satisfaction of a well-laid stone wall, each course supported by the one below it, each new thing made possible by what had been established before. Henry grew into a boy of remarkable energy and curiosity, shadowing his father on masonry work from the time he could walk steadily enough not to trip over the tools, and following his mother through the garden with the serious attention of a child who wants to understand the reason for everything. He had a habit of asking why over and over, in cascading sequences that sometimes exhausted the adults around him, and sometimes, to his parents' private delight, produced questions that neither of them could fully answer. Ada and Caleb married in the spring of 1882, in the same church where Sarah and Roscoe had been married, the steeple still standing firm on its limestone foundation, and moved into a small stone cottage that Roscoe and Caleb built together on a parcel of land adjacent to the Eastern 40. Sarah had sold them the land for exactly what it had cost her per acre, which was less than market value, and which she defended to Roscoe as a sound business decision, since having family on adjacent land increased the security and labor capacity of the entire operation, which was true and also only part of the reason. Ada had a daughter in the summer of 1883, a determined and red-haired child they named Clara, and Sarah stood as godmother with a warmth that Henry watched with the benign suspicion of a 3-year-old, who is not yet clear on what godmothers do, but is prepared to be unhappy about it if it reduces the available attention. Sarah had a second child in the autumn of 1883, a girl they named Margaret Eleanor Keene, after Roscoe's mother and Sarah's grandmother respectively, who turned out to have the red-gold hair of no obvious ancestor and the disposition of someone who has arrived with plans already made and is waiting for the world to catch up. Henry regarded Margaret with the cautious respect that older siblings develop for younger ones, who are clearly going to be trouble, and are also clearly going to be loved absolutely. The county agricultural agent Samuel Holt published a second edition of Sarah's, Working the Hard Land, in 1883 with updated chapters she had written based on 3 more years of accumulated experience. And this second edition was distributed across 4 counties, and eventually reached the new Territorial Agricultural Bureau in Austin, which wrote to Sarah requesting additional materials. She was becoming known in a way that was quiet and practical and entirely without fanfare, known to the people who needed to know the things she knew, and this was precisely the kind of known she wanted to be. Brant Collier's stone supply operation had gone out of business in 1882, unable to compete with the quality and pricing that the Eastern Forties quarry offered, and Collier himself had moved out of the county under circumstances that involved unpaid debts to several people who were considerably less patient than Sarah had been about it. She felt no particular satisfaction at this outcome beyond the professional satisfaction of having competed fairly and won, which was enough. In 1884, Redrock Flats got a school, a proper one, 2 rooms and a teacher paid by county funds, and Henry Keene was in the first class that walked through its doors, 6 years old and already reading, which his mother had seen to with books borrowed from the Hiller Ranch and purchased a few at a time from the general store. He sat in the front row on the first day and asked the teacher a question within the first 10 minutes that established his general character for the entire subsequent school year. The Eastern 40 had become something by 1885. It was 70 acres now, Sarah having purchased the adjacent 20 acres from the county the year before, and on those 70 acres there was the stone farmhouse, expanded to 5 rooms with 2 additions built from the same limestone it sat on, the 2 wells, the quarry operation running with 4 full-time workers, and a small hand-powered equipment setup that Roscoe had designed and built himself. A garden large enough to supply half the boarding houses and restaurants in the territory within a 30-mile radius, and a small orchard of drought-hardy pear and apple trees planted along the northern fence that were just beginning to produce. Sarah walked her land on a September evening in 1885, which was something she still did regularly and alone, the way you revisit a conversation that has meant something to you. The heat of summer was releasing its grip slowly, and the late afternoon light was doing its particular amber-gold thing over the pale limestone ridges. She walked to the northeastern basin, which had been deepened and improved over the years into a reliable water collection system that held enough in wet seasons to see them through the worst of the dry. She stood at its edge and looked at the land that everyone had said was worthless. She heard Roscoe behind her before she heard his footsteps, which was a skill she had developed over 7 years, some particular sensitivity to the pace and weight of him. He came and stood beside her with his hat off, and his sleeves rolled and stone dust on his hands that would never quite come all the way out of the lines. "Henry is trying to teach Margaret to read," he said. "This mostly involves Henry telling her what the words are before she can figure them out herself, and Margaret saying, 'I know,' about things she doesn't know yet." Sarah smiled without turning from the basin. "She'll figure it out," she said. "She figures everything out. She's just slower to admit when she doesn't know something." "She's very like you," he said. "She's very like both of us," Sarah said. "She has your stubbornness and my certainty, which is a potentially alarming combination." He laughed. Then they were quiet together in the way that 7 years of building something side by side produces in 2 people who still like each other, a quiet that is not empty but full. "I was thinking about the orchard," she said. "What about it?" "If we extended the northern fence 20 feet and added another 12 trees along that stretch. The water table's lower there," he said. "I know, but if we ran a line from the north well, that would work," he said. He thought about it. Yes, that would work. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon with that patient face she loved, the face that had been the first thing she had catalogued about him, steady and unhurried, a face that told you without words that whatever came next, this person would be standing here when it arrived. "Mr. Keene," she said. He looked at her. The hazel eyes, the jaw with the permanent suggestion of stubble that shaving never quite resolved. The face she had spent 7 years learning and had not yet finished. "Mrs. Keene," he said, and the name still rang the same way it had rung the first time she heard him say it, on the day they were married, a warm struck bell. "I'm glad you bid on the Devil's Plate," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So am I. You were never going to use it," she said. "No," he said, "but I was going to make sure you did." She looked at him steadily. "That was an extraordinary thing to do for a stranger." "You weren't a stranger after about 30 seconds," he said simply. "You were the woman who looked at the worst piece of land in the territory and saw what it would become. I just made sure you got the chance to be right." The light was going amber gold behind him, and the limestone ridges were silver pale against the sky, and somewhere back in the stone house that had been built from this land's own bones, their son was teaching their daughter to read in his impatient, loving way. And Ada and Caleb were in their stone cottage next door, where smoke was already rising from the chimney, and the wells were full, and the orchard was bearing, and the quarry blocks were stacked and waiting for the morning. And all of it, every bit of it, had started with 37 cents and a plan and a stranger who had seen something worth seeing. Sarah Graves, who was Sarah Keene, reached over and took her husband's hand. His hand was rough and warm and held hers with that careful steadiness that had never once in 7 years varied. "I was right," she said quietly. "About the land," he said. "About all of it," she said. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, over his heart, and they stood together on the land that had been called worthless by everyone who looked at it. And the evening light held them both, and the land held them both, and every stone wall and planted row and cleared acre was evidence of the simple truth that the right pair of eyes can see what something is before it becomes it, can see the well before the digging and the crop before the planting and the life before the living. And that sometimes the most important thing that happens to a person is that someone else looks at them and sees that same thing. The September evening settled around them, and the first stars appeared over the limestone ridges, pale points of light against a deepening sky, and the land that everyone had called the Devil's Plate was lit up in that last amber light and looked, as it always looked to those two, not like a compromise or a consolation or a piece of luck, but like exactly what it was: home. Henry called from the house, his voice carrying clear across the yard with the specificity of a child who needs both parents present for whatever announcement he is ready. And they turned together and walked back toward the light in the windows. And Roscoe's hand was warm around hers and her shoulder was against his arm. And above them, the stars arranged themselves in their ancient, reliable patterns over the Texas sky. And the stone walls of the house they had built together caught the last light and held it, steady as the people inside. In the years that followed, the Eastern 40 became known throughout the county not as the Devil's Plate but simply as the Keene Place, and people used it as a reference point when giving directions. Turn left at the Keene Place. Look for the stone house on the rocky land. You'll know it by the pear trees in the orchard and the sound of someone always working, and the particular quality of its limestone walls, which were the finest masonry in Colton County. Built by a man who knew his craft and a woman who had known her land, and which stood long after either of them were done standing, holding up the sky over the hard West Texas ground as patient and enduring as love built brick by brick, stone by stone, year by year into something the whole world had said could never grow.